Well, thank you all for coming, taking time on your Saturday. Interesting that we have the fog. I think that it's kind of propitious that we're meeting today. And it is that time, between Halloween and the Day of the Dead, that we have the legend or the lore that the veil between the living and the dead is thin. And so this is a time when people often think about communicating with lost loved ones, the spirit world in general. And so I'm delighted to be here at such a moment and to think about different cultural worldviews around death, the afterlife, why it's important. For me personally, I think it's the most important conversation we can be having. And so I think you probably all agree, given that you're here and you're members of this society. So it's my privilege. So maybe I'll start with a little personal reflection on why I'm interested in this topic and what my own historical progression has been. I guess my calling began when I was a toddler, about 18 months old. And as every good toddler does, they explore the world. And being a good empiricist, I was sampling the world. And my father had inadvertently left a can of lighter fluid on the table. And so I put it in my mouth and, lo and behold, I ended in and out of intensive care and the hospital and pneumonia and all those great things. So I feel like that gave me, without knowing, not remembering, somewhere deep in that unconscious mind, a deep reverence for health professionals, for, the doctors, the nurses, the candy stripers, all those people that were there to support me. And as a baby kind of experiencing the world, I think that was a near-death experience. Don't remember it, but I'm sure it planted seeds of curiosity for me. When I was somewhere about 16 years old, I was somewhere I shouldn't have been, with somebody I should not have been with, on the back of a motorcycle at closing time of the bar. And we were hit by a drunk driver. And it impacted the bike. It ripped my leg. I had 66 stitches ultimately. But I remember flying through the air and watching my body tumble. So that would have been a kind of out-of-body experience. And I landed with a thud on the ground, and suddenly there was a group of people around me, and they were like, call the ambulance, call the ambulance. And I was like, oh no, don't call the ambulance, And then I looked at my leg and I was like, call the ambulance. And at that point, there was this awareness that consciousness may be beyond the physicality. So that was a really interesting insight to have early. And consciousness really became a kind of calling card for me. So we went to the hospital, and my parents were about an hour and a half away, and they couldn't really do any intervention until, an adult came and signed off on it. So they were really talking about the possibility of amputating my leg. And fortunately, that didn't happen. I have two good legs to stand on, but it sort of reflected for me on, what were my dreams, what were my ambitions. I was going to be an archaeologist out in the field. I wasn't going to be able to do that if I only had one leg. And so they put me in a cast from my hip down to my ankle. And I remember being in my parents' living room, our family living room, and I don't know where this idea came from. One could say it was noetic or intuitive. My father was a tool and die maker. My mother was a housewife. So it wasn't like I came from a medical family. But I was very, very interested in the idea that I could harness my awareness, my consciousness, my imagination to heal my leg. And so I remember laying on the couch and visualizing my immune system healing my body. And I would feel the tingles going up my leg. I mean, it was a very somatic experience, very visceral. And sure enough, when I went back to the hospital and they removed the cast, I was, wasn't like it was a spontaneous recovery. It wasn't, but I healed, and that gave me another insight into the way that there are these powers and potentials of our consciousness. Not only, having had that out-of-body experience, but also then the fact that I could harness my imagination to help with my healing process. And like I said, I don't know where that came from. Maybe there'd been some show on television. Maybe, it would have been 1974, probably somewhere in there. And so all these things were, a calling for me. Then I grew up in Detroit. And, it was a time of unrest. And I remember feeling a lot of pain about the state of the world, the state of society. And I wanted to do something. But as a teenager, I felt very impotent. So I really didn't know what to do. And it wasn't until I got to Wayne State University and this experimental program called Monteith College. And it was like, if you're familiar with Antioch, or, it was one of these intensive programs, high ratio of faculty to students. And the whole curriculum for 4 years was around Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions. And so the idea that we are living in a paradigm shift, and that something like science, which we think of as absolute and certain and reliable, has changed periodically over time. And that said to me, maybe this reality that I was experiencing in Detroit at this time wasn't fixed or absolute. Maybe there was this possibility that we could change things. And so it became, the driving force for me that I wanted to be part of a paradigm shift. And I wanted to be a revolutionary on the cutting edge of science. And it felt like consciousness was a good gateway there. And about that time, I also was doing an internship with one of the professors at the medical school. And he gave me this book called Psychic Exploration by Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo 14 astronaut. And that book was made up, it's an edited book, and it's made up of scientists, philosophers, health professionals talking about this cutting edge of science, which is really these powers and potentials of our consciousness, and in particular, sort of the non-material aspects of consciousness. And that was it. I was off and running. And it got me to, Monteith College got phased out because it was too expensive. And so I ended up coming and doing my last year of my undergrad here in Irvine, at the University of California, Irvine. Great experience. Studied with a guy named Robert Morris, who my friend Jessica's here, and she knows Bob, knew Bob. And then I went from there to the Institute for Parapsychology in Durham, North Carolina, and then just one thing after another. I've worked in different research labs, traveled all over the world, been one of those intrepid, scholars and curious seekers, and have done all kinds of wild and crazy research. And, when we have a little more time or later, we can talk about some of that. But all that by saying that's kind of my backstory. And about that time, I became really interested in how does science interface with these, sometimes mystical experiences, or these, non-ordinary, not everyday experiences. And I started teaching probably 1979, 1980 about survival of consciousness after bodily death. And did some research. Again, the idea that there are these non-local or non-physical aspects of consciousness that may be able to reach out and engage the physical world. So I started doing studies on that. And then, over the years, I went to various places, did various things. But when I went to the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which, by the way, I never applied for that job, and Edgar Mitchell founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences. So it was kind of one of those synchronistic things that the person who edited the book that changed my life started this foundation that I ended up spending 25 years at and doing some pretty amazing research with this team of people and, a very international reach. So I've had a lot of privilege in terms of the people I've worked with and the places I've been. But we were visited often by people who had a strong interest, either from their own personal experiences of non-ordinary things happening, and or scientists who came through. And so I started videoing what people were describing. And so I guess that kind of culminated in working with Deepak Chopra. And so he had just lost a very close friend of his, and he was leading a workshop in Sedona, Arizona. And so he had asked me to come in and fill in for David Simons, who wasn't able to present, obviously. And so I showed a little bit of some of these videos that I had collected. And one of them was Bruce Grayson, who's a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. He had picked up on Ian Stevenson's work on reincarnation. He was somebody who had been documenting these experiences people had had. And I think the particular clip was of him describing Pam Reynolds' near-death experience. And so Pam Reynolds had had a serious health condition. They were trying to do surgery with her, and in order to do it, they had basically made her dead. They took the blood out of her body, they put her at a very cold temperature, and she had a mystical experience, and she saw her body from the ceiling of the room. And so I showed this, being told from the perspective of a very well-regarded psychiatrist. So this wasn't just, somebody off the street. This is somebody very legitimate. And he was telling the story, with an open-minded kind of skepticism, I would say. Well, anyway, Deepak then called me into his office and he said, "Marilyn, let's make a movie." And I thought, okay, who wouldn't want to make a movie with Deepak Chopra? So I went to bed that night. The morning I woke up, utter panic. I do not want to make a movie. I can't do it. And it was mostly, it was daunting to think about the fundraising that it would take to, get the kind of production values that I wanted to have. And I had lunch with him that day, and he's like, "Oh, Marilyn, don't worry about the money will come." And I'd like to say it was just like that. It wasn't, but it did come eventually, and we made a movie. There's copies of it at the back. Anyway, so that really galvanized me to start thinking about, what can I contribute to this conversation? And obviously, my passion is helping people to feel comfortable and recognizing that the fear of death may be the most limiting factor for us. And it got to be more than that. It got to be more about my reading the literature and studying the scholars and learning that as people deny their own mortality, it can lead to very aberrant behaviors. So we think about the intolerance that we experience as a culture right now, and it's historical. I mean, throughout time, people have been warring over differences in their worldviews and their belief systems. But if we can begin to appease that anxiety and fear and open to other perspectives, we may be able to live our lives better. We may be able to share with others in ways that are more based in curiosity and engagement rather than animosity and conflict. So going back to my original desire to be, on the cusp of a paradigm shift, this felt like a really potent kind of conversation to invite. So that's kind of, the film we made has traveled all over the world now and aired on Oprah and probably has had a couple million views at this point. And we also created other materials. And so if you go to my website, you'll see there's a lot of free material there. Facilitation guides for watching the movie in conversation with groups. And one of the things that we were really interested in is how to help health professionals who aren't trained to deal with death. They're heroic, and you are going to save this life no matter what, even if it's not the appropriate thing to do. And what happens when people get to that space? A lot of hospice workers will tell you that a lot of very interesting things start happening about that time. And so we created a guide for health professionals to have those conversations. So there are a lot of things that, were happening in terms of our taking this out into the world and making it accessible and helping people to have those kind of conversations. So that was a long preamble to how I came to be up here. So I want to talk about a couple of things. How many of you are familiar with Ernest Becker's work on the denial of death? Just a little show of hand. Denial of death. So Ernest Becker wrote this book. It was in 1973. And it really did start the conversation at a more general level. He was an anthropologist, and he was really interested in what was happening at a cultural level around death. And he actually won a Pulitzer for this book, Denial of Death. And I encourage you to check it out. It was very generative in the sense that it led to a whole bunch of other things. And I want to talk a little bit about those other things as well as Becker's work. So Becker was talking about how the big human paradox is our fear of death. And that culture becomes this scaffolding or armor in a certain way for shielding us from our own anxieties and death anxiety or the fear of mortality. And so people do heroic things to try and shield themselves from dealing with the inevitability of their mortality. And so he was talking about how there are different kind of cultural projects people engage in. They build statues or they do things that will keep them alive through eternity. But we know that doesn't really help that much. And also that if you look at different cultures, you see that there are different approaches to death. And, not only the death process itself, which we can talk about, but also what happens after. And so most cultures have some kind of cosmology or mythology, some belief system. And what happens if people get triggered, according to Becker, and this has now been substantiated by a lot of research in an area called terror management theory. So the idea that we have a core existential terror around death. And if we get triggered around our fears, it, as I mentioned, can lead to these aberrant behaviors. So people's fear can lead them to become very protective of their in-group because their in-group is giving them that scaffolding to protect them from this fear and this anxiety. And then they become very aggressive towards the out-group. So you can think about tribalism. And we think about tribalism as something that happens far away, maybe in Africa where people have lived in these kind of tribal communities. But it's right here. And all you have to do is turn on the news and you will see different tribes manifesting. So I think that one of the things for us to do is facilitate curiosity around what other people hold as the definition of their worldview. Like, what is the purpose of living? And what's going to happen when we die? And we can see that it takes form in a variety of different ways. So in modern society, we can see that people do things to try and shield themselves. So we watch television, or we play video games, maybe we come to groups. I actually don't think this kind of group is what I'm talking about. I think, coming and being ready to have this conversation is the most important step you can take. And not only just because, it feels good to think about new things and new ideas, but because it could truly make your life better. And as you begin to have more comfort in these kind of existential questions, it can help us to move away from some of the distractions. We talk about these weapons of mass distraction that are constantly throwing us off course. So it's, really important. And so Becker talked about it as a kind of heroism. So we're in this heroic venture to shield ourselves, or we're in this heroic venture to stand up for what is so. And mortality is one of those things. It's the big thing, and it's the big sort of woolly mystery that we don't really understand. So how can we, understand ourselves and our own cosmology? So, inviting you to think about what was, some of your earlier experiences of death? Maybe it was a pet, when you were very young. Maybe it was a family member. Maybe it was multiple family members, and what was happening during that time? So I invite you let's pause for a second and kind of go back in time to your own lived experience of what you recall around your kind of first encounters with death. What were the circumstances? What were the reactions? How did your family respond? And what were you told? What were you told you should do? So I think that I'd like to come back and maybe talk about some of that when we get into our discussion period. But, you might think that there was fear. You might think there was denial. If you were young, maybe your family didn't want you in the room. Maybe you shouldn't witness this. So people have different experiences, and there are different ways that cultures approach this. So I then want to kind of transition to this idea of terror management theory. So Becker's work inspired a team of social scientists, primarily social psychologists, who were really interested in how could we study this and how could we do controlled experiments around it. So, for example, one of the studies that they did was working with a group of judges who were sentencing prostitutes. And they gave half of the judges what they call a mortality salience prompt. So it's a set of questions that they have. But for example, what do you think will happen to your body at the point of death? And they would ask these judges to write about it. So journaling is an important part of bringing this into people's awareness. So half the judges wrote about this mortality salience prompt, and half of them didn't. And what they found is that the judges who had gotten the prompt gave much harsher sentences to these prostitutes than those who didn't. Okay, so this is a bit of a dilemma, right? Because here we are talking about, well, let's talk about death. But if people are given these kind of prompts, which you may be getting if you turn on the television, listening to the news, and you wonder why we're kind of in this state we're in. It's because people are getting these triggers, they're getting these prompts, but they're not given the cushions to assuage the fear and anxiety. So they did other things, like they looked at, they're clever. I think social psychologists, anybody a social psychologist here? Most clever group. They come up with these very interesting experiments. So this one was on hot chili peppers. And so people were instructed to give hot chili to another person. And if they'd gotten the mortality salience prompt, they were much more vindictive. They got the hot going there, and they were really amplifying the kind of distress that they'd be causing to another person. Fascinating. So you might say, well, what do we do about that? And so there have been attempts to then figure out, how do we buffer? So what are the anxiety buffers? And the whole social emotional intelligence movement is an important buffer. And if you can give people prompts for self-esteem, for example, and having positive self-esteem, that can be a very vital kind of buffer for the terror that people experience. And also the kind of retaliatory actions that people take when they're triggered. So there's been a lot of work done on this. There's actually hundreds of studies now that have looked at, replicating these kinds of experiences and then looking at what we can do to help people not be so reactive and not be so aggressive. And that's ultimately what we're looking for, right? We want to have a better world. We want to be more comfortable with each other. We want, our families to live better. And I think ultimately we want to have more compassion and empathy for people whose views may be fundamentally different from our own. And that is tough work. So we know now that there's all these cognitive biases that we have, right? There's these things lurking below the surface. So for example, inattentional blindness. Fascinating. There are hundreds of these biases that have been identified now, or the confirmation bias. I'm going to find what I expect to see. And I expect that person over there who looks different from me to not be a good person. So I'm going to find ways to confirm that. The inattentional blindness one, you may have seen the gorilla in the middle of the basketball game. Anybody seen that? It's very well viewed and experienced, and that's another social psychology experiment. So what they did is they had a basketball game, and you're instructed to count the number of times that one of the teams, the team in the white shirts, for example, takes possession of the ball. So you're sitting here watching on the screen this basketball game. And you're really watching it. And you're counting, because now we could even introduce that there's a gender bias. So women do better on this, or men do better on this. And so people then get a little competitive about this counting of the number of ball passes. Well, right in the middle of the video is a gorilla who walks out, obviously it's a costume, and he comes out into the middle of the screen and he beats his chest. He doesn't stay long, but he's there. And then you finish the experiment. It doesn't last long. It's maybe a minute or a minute and a half. And you ask people, okay, how many ball passes did you see? And people, it's this many, this many. And then you say, did you notice anything else? Well, I noticed that, some people pass the ball more readily than others. Or, they notice things about the ball pass. Did you notice anything else? And today, if I showed you this, probably the majority of you would see the gorilla, because it's now part of our culture. People have seen it. They've talked about it. It's been written about in books. But when this started, probably Richard Wiseman was the one that turned me on to this. People didn't notice the gorilla. I have a teacher, he's a friend, Brother David Stendelrast, and he's a Benedictine monk. I had to show it to him 3 times, and I had to point to the gorilla, because he's such a good meditator, and he can harness his attention. So he never, ever saw the gorilla. People used to get really mad because they thought you were tricking them. They thought it was a replacement video, because it was just impossible that happened, that there was that gorilla and I missed it. So that's inattentional blindness. So the same thing happens every day in our lives. And these cognitive biases are very disconcerting, because we think we're seeing the world, and we think we're seeing the world the way it is. But with all these, the confirmation bias and inattentional blindness and, the host of other things that are out there bombarding us, we don't. So again, coming back to this idea of terror management theory, I am predisposed to see things a certain way. And if you go back to Becker's work, I have this armor that's going to protect me from seeing things I don't want to see. And so that's where I think us having conversation and being able to think about how these things trigger polarization. And that if we become very, like I said, people would get mad about this video. I mean, they got mad, and people would demand to see it again. And, and accusing the person who was showing it to them of malfeasance because they really did not want to think that they had missed it. So this is how we are. We're built for this. Our brains are built for it. We have this wonderful amygdala that's an old part of our brain. Fight or flight, we hear about that, right? And then you've got this prefrontal piece, which is, later in our evolutionary process. And if we can engage that prefrontal, which is more the rational, discerning, self-reflective part of our brain, we can get past that fight or flight thing. And what happens in the terror management literature is that amygdala gets hijacked. And suddenly we're aggressive. Suddenly we're fighting, the Muslims. I just was in a book club, and it's a very progressive group. We were talking about this wonderful book. It's called Caste. And then there's a movie, it's called Origin. Caste is written by, I think she's a historian. And she's an African-American woman who talks about, we think about the caste system in India. We think about how that influences people's social order. But she uses this construct to think about America. And instead of just talking about racism, she talks about casteism. And she also talks about it as a cognitive bias. So it's below the threshold of our conscious awareness. We're not seeing that we're judging people based on their position. And certainly during slavery, it was a big issue. People were put over here. Before slavery, it was like the immigrants who had come from maybe Ireland, Scotland, Asia, to work on the railroads. Those people were marginalized and put there. When slavery became part of the social order, that became sort of scapegoats, or they became the place on the social ladder that was at the bottom. So I was in this book group, and it's a pretty diverse group. It's not as diverse as I would like it to be, and I would like to figure out how to make it more diverse. But everybody's really good about thinking of their own biases. They're thinking about, where am I prejudiced? Where do I feel hatred toward the other? And we had a very lively conversation about it. And then, one of the women, she's from France. And she's like, well, but, not the Muslims. And I'm like, what? Not the Muslims. The Muslims are, because immigration is a huge issue all over the world right now. It's not only just here where, where's ICE when we, but so we were talking about Europe and how there is this caste system in Europe and the aggression toward people who are different. And we have a tolerance for certain kinds of difference. And suddenly I was hearing from these very enlightened, very educated women about, the Muslims. And I'm like, oh, please don't do that. I mean, think of how many, many, many different people there are who identify with a particular religion. And so that opened us up to a really interesting conversation. So I encourage you to check out the book Caste. She talks about how in Nazi Germany, when they were creating the caste system against the Jews, and you know where they looked to get the recipe for how they were going to marginalize the Jewish population? From America. They were looking at how Americans set up the slavery system. And they used that as a kind of template for organizing the social order. So this idea of, she wants to replace the concept of racism for casteism, which I think is, we could debate that, and that's not what this topic is. But I think it's an interesting concept because caste allows for more fluidity than just the color of skin or just the religion or educational level or economics. It's kind of all of that put together. And so it's a really interesting thing. Okay. So now I want to kind of switch gears a little bit. So Ernest Becker, anthropologist, talking about how culture becomes this both way of insulating us from terror because it builds cosmology. Then the terror management theory work where we can see with very reliable data under really good controlled conditions how this idea of triggering people's death anxiety can lead to aberrant behaviors. Like, for example, another one they did, people are walking by a cemetery and somebody drops a notebook. Well, the people who have been triggered on the death anxiety prompt, the mortality salience prompt, are less likely to help a person pick up their notebook than somebody who has been given these kind of positive reinforcements about you're a good person, you have good self-esteem. And so this is just a very trivial thing. Or the bystander effect. Here's another one where, somebody is getting beaten up and we assume that somebody else is going to take care of that. We're not going to take care of it. And that gets triggered by these mortality salience prompts. Okay, so now let's talk about my favorite topic, which is culture and how different cultures hold death and the afterlife. And again, I go back to your early experience around death and how your family held it and how you were instructed to behave and believe. And I go back to this idea of worldview. So what is a worldview? A worldview is a lens of perception about the world that influences absolutely everything in our lives, but we don't even know we have it. We don't even know we're wearing these glasses. They are so deeply ingrained in us. So those things that happen to us very quickly, those decisions we make, are something that comes from our worldview. And you can think, well, what's shaped my worldview? Probably family, early conditioning was a big factor. It might have been the religion you were brought up. It might have been the schools and the teachers that you experienced. It might have been your neighborhood. Was your neighborhood tribal? We had a really fascinating conversation with an Asian woman last night, and she was talking about, her own experience of this kind of tribalism and, growing up and, what was tolerated and what wasn't. Fascinating stuff. So different cultures treat death and death awareness, death preparation, and cosmologies of the afterlife in very different ways. So sometimes I think it's easier to tolerate somebody who looks really different. Like if they're dressed in a very different fashion, they clearly are from a different cultural group. I might be more accepting of them just because I expect them to be different. But what happens when they're sitting next to you, they're dressed the same, eat the same food, but have a different political orientation? You could just do that one for a minute. Wow. And it is really hot right now. right? So how do we find that place in ourselves where we can kind of slow down and begin to reflect on what just triggered me and where did that trigger come from? So different cultures have different views. So we live in a materialist culture, right? And so that means that we like stuff and we buy stuff, and maybe buying stuff helps us. And so when you think about what happens when you die, if you're a diehard materialist, kind of pun intended, I guess, I think that it can provoke fear because there's going to be nothing there. And when I'm dead, I'm gone, nothing. And for some people, that's a comfortable place to be. You know, they lived a good life, they're fine with it. And I applaud that. But for a lot of other people, it can be really scary. And we see that in this culture. You know, there is a lot of resistance. One of the things that happens, you know, you hear hospice people talk about this a lot, actually, that at the point of death in our culture, people will often do something like reach up. And it's as though someone is coming to help guide them. Well, that gets us past materialism and into then some kind of transpersonal experience. And for a lot of these people, it isn't their religion. It could be their actual experience, that they're having these metaphysical encounters with the other side. And I think that that's something that if your health professional can know to expect that or be comfortable with that, they will spend less time trying to deny it. And especially at, you know, that point where you may be suffering or your family may be suffering, instead of denying it, instead of activating all those defense mechanisms, you allow for that experience. And the process can be much easier. Christianity. So we live in a Christian society, by and large. And so we've got heaven and hell. We've got the resurrection. And we have really a lot of fear. You know, it's like, did I live a good life? Am I going to be punished? You know, and I find that some of the greatest resistance in terms of cultural worldviews comes out of the Christian perspective. Not all Christians and not all people. Obviously, we have so many different people who respond in different ways. But that is the idea that there's kind of a moral accountability and that faith can help us to, you know, find the way to heaven. Hindus. The Hindu tradition is rich with sort of the iconography of death and the afterlife, all of the statues, the belief systems around karma. If I live my life well, I may reincarnate, I may come back in a more advanced form. So that's a very comforting thing for people who have grown up in that tradition. And it's also a good standard for living a good life, right? Because I will find, you know, something on the other side that will help me, and I will be able to come back in a better way. Buddhism. Buddhism is very popular in the United States. I think it's one of the more tolerated other traditions, you know, and you hear about the Jew-boos or, you know, Christians who are also kind of favoring a Buddhist perspective. We know mindfulness meditation now is very widespread. It's used commonly in healthcare, psychology. So the idea that we're going to continue to be reborn until such time as we become enlightened. One of the really interesting things, like in Tibetan Buddhism, is they call it the sky burial. And this is usually from some adept who has been, you know, they feel is at that stage of enlightenment. And because they don't identify with the body, consciousness is beyond the body. They do this practice where they have somebody who's skilled at doing this, and they chop the person up. They take them to a mountaintop and they feed them to the vultures. This is good. This is what you want to have happen. And it's because this thing is temporary. And once you've become enlightened, you don't need this. You just need the consciousness to be liberated. And that is, obviously a little different than how we practice. Although, cremation is something, Hindus do a lot with cremation. The Buddhists, this is not a standard practice. This is something that is really the most enlightened people. And we had when I was working at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, we gave a grant to a guy, Father Tiso. And he's a linguist and cultural practitioner. And he actually went and interviewed people who had witnessed what's called the rainbow body. So at the point of death, what can happen is as consciousness leaves the body or the soul leaves the body, they experience rainbows. And so he was actually, and then often the body dematerializes in this lore. And he actually, did kind of a ethnographic study where he interviewed people who had experienced it. And so he had eyewitnesses who saw that what gets left is like fingernails, maybe teeth, but the body itself disappears. Again, it's not common. You will find it like in the Catholic Church also has some parallels to that. There are people who are, advanced in their tradition, in their faith. Indigenous practices. So, what do we mean by that? But, in first world cultures, we are much more integrated with the natural world. And so it's not as likely that we're going to fear death. One of the groups that I have had the privilege of working with are the Achuar in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And so they have a belief that, the soul is separate from the body and that they are one with nature. And so at night, they believe that the soul leaves the body, travels around in the forest and the animal world. And, if you wake up in the morning and you read a newspaper, you're getting information about what happened when you slept. For them, the dream life becomes that space. And it's their social responsibility to come back in the morning. They get up really early, pre-dawn, and they drink this Wayusa tea, and they share the content of their dreams. And it's usual for an adult, like an elder in the household, to interpret the dreams. But they believe that that soul is traveling around, getting reliable information that will help them to navigate during waking life. Well, the same thing when you die, you return to nature and you become more present in, maybe it's the animal world, maybe it's, the trees. And there is, a concept of sort of lineage. Like in the Aboriginal cultures in Australia, they have the song lines. And the song lines help you to navigate in the physical plane, but it also is the connection to the ancestors. So an ancestor might be in this big rock, and the ancestor has a song, and the song will help you navigate. I have a colleague, David Abrams, who has studied with the indigenous people in Australia. And he was in a truck, and he was meeting with one of the elders in the Aboriginal culture. And this elder had to start talking faster and faster and faster and faster, because he was like tapping into the song lines that are embedded in these monuments out in these desert places, these huge boulders, for example. And because he was in a truck and he was moving fast, he had to go faster as he was listening to the songs. It's fascinating, and so that's a way in which the natural world all around is imbued with the survival of consciousness after death. It isn't separate. It is one with. And the process of dying is much more about our connection to a lineage, for example. The Islamic tradition. So I have a friend who's an imam, and he talks about, in in the tradition, in the Quran, for example, they talk about how, we talk about life and death, right? Deepak likes to talk about birth and death because there's this continuum of consciousness. And birth is that point where we come into the embodiment. Death is where the consciousness leaves the embodiment. But for the Islamic tradition, there's death and then there's life. So death is that thing that is temporary. We leave the physical, and then we go to this place in, it's kind of like the way he described it as like a honeycomb. And you get positioned in the honeycomb, but you will be there, and that's gonna last forever. And so you are in a place of divine judgment. So again, there's a moral code, and it is very much related to how much devotion you have given to your tradition, how much you have, prayed, how much you have contemplated, and how righteous your life has been, how you have lived a good life. So I think that's one of them we just don't have a good understanding of. And it is rather paradoxical from, a Western perspective. The Jewish tradition, there's a world to come, but the emphasis is really living a moral life now. So it's less about thinking about what's going to happen when I die, but it's more about having ethical action. And so there's a lot of practice, a lot of charitable deeds that people live. And then my friend Duarte's here. She's a colleague of mine at Sophia University. We talk a lot about the transpersonal. And so this is a path that maybe a lot of you are kind of closeted transpersonalites. And that's basically this idea that there is this aspect of our being that may be beyond the body. So next month, when you have these people who are talking about their near-death experiences, they probably had some kind of transpersonal experience. They felt their consciousness, like I described with my motorcycle accident. I actually saw my body. And when you have those experiences firsthand, it's really very affirming. And you can begin to think about, what's possible. And these kind of transpersonal philosophies that, Maslow was, the famous guy that we talk about. He had this hierarchy of needs. So you go from your basic needs. I need shelter. I need food. I need family to support me. I need my culture to support me. But he begins to start talking about self-actualization. And a lot of people stop there. Okay, well, I'm self-actualized. But he really started, particularly later in his life, to talk about self-transcendence. And so how do we get into that transpersonal place where it isn't just about me? And if we go back to the denial of death, how do I leave my legacy? How am I, in a transpersonal way, connecting beyond the me to the we? And that's a very powerful idea, and it leads to kind of unity thinking, where we can begin to appreciate across cultures different perspectives, different vantage points. So I guess there's one more thing I want to mention before I reach the bottom of this hour. And that is the research I'm doing right now. And I have a mailing list back there. If you're interested, signing, I can let you know when things are happening. But the project is called the Psychomantium. And this is an ancient practice. So if you think about the Greek oracles, if you were a head of state during ancient Greece, you wanted to get reliable information about war, typically, or some activity, kind of like the Achuar in the indigenous culture. You want to access the transpersonal so that you can navigate today. And so they would go and consult the Greek oracle. And the Greek oracle would get into a trance-like state and be able to consult with the gods and provide, provide information to these leaders. And often they did this by gazing at a reflective pool. Or you think about the Aladdin's lamp, going back to Islam. So if you polish the lamp, the genie comes out, right? We all know that. Well, that is, again, a reflective surface. You're polishing the mirror or the brass or the whatever reflective surface it is. And then you can gaze into that, and the genie's a metaphor, right? It's the metaphor for the spirit world. And you can begin to consult with the spirit world in order to get information. You may be able to communicate with the gods or the spirits or departed loved ones. So Raymond Moody is a psychiatrist who has done a lot of work with grief. And he was really, it's a very difficult topic, you know, and anybody who does therapy stuff knows that, you know, people who are grieving, it's a very tough place. And so he was trying to figure out some kind of more innovative ways to work with his clients, his patients. And so he recreated this idea of the psychomantium in his clinic. So basically what you do is you take a mirror and you have a candle, and the mirror is just barely illuminated. And you have a person sitting, reflecting on the mirror, not seeing themselves because the mirror is a little above. So what you're seeing is this dimly illuminated reflective surface. And you are invited to have whatever the experience is, but in his case, he invited people to have that conversation with a departed loved one who they never had that final conversation. And what he found from a clinical point of view was that it was very efficacious. People were having breakthroughs. So scientists started bringing this into a laboratory. And at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, a man named Arthur Hastings began to do this research. And so the work we're doing is a continuation of what Arthur started with. And so basically, we do the illumination. We measure grief before and after. We measure absorption before and after. Like, how deeply are people getting into the experience? And then we look at what were the qualities of that experience. And it's very multisensory. I mean, I had a woman, I showed the film a couple days ago, and this woman had been in my experiment, and she was talking about how powerful the experience had been for her. She had lost somebody, she loved them very, very much, and she connected with them. And the thing that really struck me is here she was, it was about 2 years after we'd actually done the session, and she said she thinks about it every day. And she feels so connected. It was profound and transformative. So what we did, and Dorothy and I were working on this, the initial project was with a comparison between the chamber with the mirror and virtual reality. So we're kind of bringing it into an idea that this is portable. It's something people can do from the comfort of their homes. And I consulted with a very well-regarded hypnotherapist, Carrie Gaynor, and he helped guide the meditation. So he helped me find like places in this sort of self-hypnosis, creative imagination process. So the current experiment, and we're looking for people to participate, involves virtual reality. It's what we're calling talent and training. So the talent is we're looking at how important is absorption. And we're measuring it with people who have low absorption and high absorption. And then repetition. So like this woman who came to my screening the other day, she wanted to do it over and over again. I mean, she was really into it. And I love her. You know, she was just such an advocate for doing this study, and I had everybody signing up for it, which was great. So it's something that helps us to consider how we can use technology as a tool for potentially connecting to the spirit world if you have somebody in particular you want to connect to. We don't actually in this study instruct people about what to aim for, because I'm really interested in where do they go with the experience. But anyway, so that's something that we're doing right now. The first study that we looked at showed a positive correlation with grief. So people found it very therapeutic. The higher the absorption, the higher the benefit from the experience. And so this one is a very interesting mindfulness kind of practice. It's probably a little different than what people have done before. And, we have a lot of sort of safeguards. We've got, a clinical psychologist who's a consultant. So if anything goes awry, never seen it go awry, by the way. It's always been a positive experience for people. So I guess that's it for my presentation. And what they are asking us to do for our discussion is make sure that if you want to speak, wait for the mic to come to you. That's what she meant by don't talk to me directly, because everybody in the room wants to hear what you have to say. So that's, I think, the reason, that's the motivation. Not that I don't want to have an intimate conversation with you, I do. But so, going back to thinking about your own experience, your own tradition, how you come to be in this room today. I mean, I'm really fascinated by people who choose to come on a Saturday morning to talk about death. What's up with that? I'd love to hear what you think and what your experiences have been and what you're aiming for in, facilitating conversation with loved ones. So anybody want to start? And we've got the mic. And
I experienced my mom dying about 4 years ago, and she was on life support for 3 years. And when they told me to come see her, she was dying. She was pronounced dead, but when I walked in, she turned around and looked at me and gave me the shiny look. Could you explain that?
Well, a lot of this is a mystery, right? But they do say that our consciousness survives beyond the shutdown of the biology. So, and also, people will wait for a loved one to come before they make the transition. That's not uncommon. And then, like I said, people can be dead physically, according to those instruments out there. But when that person comes and they hear that voice, it can bring them back temporarily. Temporarily in the sense of, you being able to actually have that physical shiny hit. So it's not uncommon. What is less common is the health professionals being prepared for that. And that's one of the reasons I love to have these conversations. And I've gone and talked to doctors and nurses, and I think that the more they can be comfortable, because they have their own cognitive biases, and they don't want to be prepared for that. But I hope that was a beautiful experience for you. Oh, it was. Yeah, great. Love that. Thank you.
I just wanted to share when my mother was near death, the hospice people told us some people prefer to die alone, and others prefer to die with loved ones around them. So she said, why don't you leave for a period of time, but tell her how long you'll be gone, like 30 minutes, an hour, and give her a chance if she wants to move on. So I was going to get my hair done, so I said, Mama, I'm going to be gone 1 hour. So I went to the salon. It was very close, and she started to work on my hair. And the stylist was called to the phone. All of a sudden, I found myself running up to the desk, absolutely running. And I'm thinking, what in the heck is going on? And when I got to the desk, I said, I guess I'm just concerned about my mother, but I'm going to be home in just a few minutes. And she said, no, use my phone. So I called. It was busy because my mother had just died, and they were calling. So that was meaningful to me.
There's a lot more volition around these things than sometimes we anticipate. And even the timing of death, like many people, it's reported that things like holidays, people will die right after the holiday because they're waiting, or a birthday, something special. There's also, I think is it Friday night or Monday? a day of the week that is more likely to be associated. It's Monday. Yeah, my father died like Sunday night, like during the night. And you know, it's like they've got all kinds of things that may be coming up. For him, I think it was a lot of anxiety about what Monday represented for him. So, you know, they can check out, and that should be our right. I truly believe that.
I had an extremely unusual, childhood, really, because I grew up in a house that seemed to be surrounded by people who passed away. Mm-hmm. So I've had a lot of experiences. We used to play Ouija board quite a lot, and talk to different people. And I was told that in the middle of the night, we had myself and my roommate. We had just shut off the lights to go to sleep, and we heard footsteps going through the house on the linoleum. Nobody was in the house. We were there by ourselves. So we got very scared and went around the house trying to see what the heck was going on. Finally, we tried to go back to sleep, and we heard the footsteps again that came up to the door. And then I said, let's see if we learn anything if we play Ouija board. And we played Ouija board. And Ouija board, according to that, it was very, very, active. And the Ouija board said, tell Nutsy Fagin that I came for James. Tell Nutsy Fagin that I came for James. Tell Nutsy, kept saying it over and over and over. Well, my cousin and I, as my roommate, we were really scared. We went to sleep with the lights on for the rest of the night. As soon as it was time enough to call my mom, I called my mom and told her the experience that we had. And she said to me, you don't know who Nutsy Fagin is? I said, no, who's Nutsy Fagin? She said, that's what your grandmother, who passed away when my father was like 10, that's what your grandmother used to call your father, Nutsy Fagin. So tell Nutsy Fagin I came for James, and said that over and over and over. So then my mother immediately called my father, because they were divorced, called my father and told him the experience that I had. And he said, I just got off the phone right now because I have to book a plane to go to Ireland. My grandfather was in Ireland visiting his sister, and he passed away. And his name was James. And she came for James. That's an actual story.
So let me ask you, when you've had that experience now and you're looking back at it, how did that impact you now? I mean, you were scared in that moment. Has it given you some comfort? Does it still destabilize you? How do you feel?
It let me know for sure that when we leave the dimension of Earth, we go to another dimension, but we're still alive. We're still alive because, that's kind of a part of our family. We play Ouija board a lot, like people play cards. We play Ouija board a lot.
Cool. Still?
So, no, I haven't been with my family for a few years. Uh-huh. But growing up, that's what we did. Okay. So it was just part of our activities. So, to have had an experience like that, and others that were involved, because I have had many experiences with people who passed on. I know in my mind that we go on to another dimension somewhere. I don't know where it is, whatever, but we do not die, because I've communicated with many, many people who have passed on. So.
Well, I didn't need to tell the story, you just did, so thank you. I think we're weaving. That's kind of how I view it. Okay.
My mother gave me that book by Raymond Moody called Reunion, and it's all about what you talked about, and she wants us to look in her mirror and communicate with my son who passed a few months ago. So that was fascinating, like kind of a little trigger that maybe I should read the book. Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to ask you, why do you think that people who were given, you called it the prompt, the judges got the prompt, about, like, I would think if I was given prompts to think about my mortality and think about maybe an afterlife, that it would make me more compassionate, not less compassionate. And you mentioned it in a couple of different situations, and they were both less compassionate. So I'm wondering why you think that is.
Well, the prompts are things like, think about what your body will look like at the moment of death. And if you're not prepared for that, if you have not considered it, it could destabilize you. It could be scary to you. And so that's, I think, the rationale for that, is that it's triggering something without giving the context. So you obviously come here, you're comfortable with, a kind of conversation around these things. So less likely to find it as a trigger. But for somebody who doesn't think about it and doesn't want to die, and I'm never going to die, kind of thing, it can really, make it very uncomfortable. So I think that's the motivation or the intention. And, Becker's work was really the stimulus for these terror management theory studies. And then they found ways to appease it. So people can, with, different kinds of psychological approaches or meditation, doing contemplative practices, being out in nature bathing is something that, as you're connecting with the living world and knowing that it's transitional, can be very comforting for people. But yeah, I'm sorry for your loss, though. It's never easy, is it?
So Marilyn, are you saying that essentially with these judges, because I was curious about that too, is that they're essentially projecting their fear of death onto the prostitutes, that's why they sentence them so harshly?
I don't know so much about projecting as getting triggered in their own discomfort. And they get scared, yes. And you think about a judge, they're in power, they're in control. And suddenly you're reminding them that maybe they don't have as much control as they thought they had. So I think that that's probably a big part of it.
So I had the near death, like out of body, going through the tunnel whole thing when I was in my late 20s due to a cardiac arrest event, and it also sort of ended my terror management through drugs and alcohol. I went on to a different terror management after that. But at the end of but it gave me a whole different perspective on what was really important in life. So I wasn't as easily, and still I'm not as easily, triggered by what's going on in the world and the events around me, because in the end, it's all not that important. It's going to resolve the way it's going to resolve. But it brought me up to the point, I married a man a lot older than myself, and he had often said that his real life began on Pearl Harbor Day because it enabled him to enter into the service, learn how to be a pilot, and then he had a long, successful career with a major airlines afterwards. And he died on Pearl Harbor Day. Wow. And I wasn't present at his death, but he died while they had daily mass on TV, on Catholic TV, and he had been a daily mass goer. So for him, that would be the best way to go. But when I got there, I had beaten myself up for years even afterwards because I wasn't there at the moment of death like I had always planned to be, but I strongly felt his presence in the room. And then hearing you talk about it more today, I suddenly realized, as much as he didn't want to leave me, he didn't want me to be there when he died either. And that the way it turned out is probably the way it was supposed to be. And then 6 years ago, I got involved with this group called the Evolutionary Collective, which Patricia Albert, I'm not sure if you're familiar with her work, but it does transcend this idea of our bodies not being a terribly important part of how we face the world, you know. So I thought your vulture story was pretty funny, you know. And American Indians had something similar that they did, the Plains Indians with the raised beds where, you know, the vultures would come and, not to be gross or whatever. But, you know, I've often thought that the last thing I really need to want to think about is my body, although some fillers would be great. You know. So, but I wanted to just comment about how grateful I am to have heard you talk about how sometimes people depart the scene the way they want to.
Right.
And, you know, that my being there was not terribly important. And I think, you know, I have a daughter who's really struggling with terror management issues. And she never really got to have that final conversation with her father. You know, he had dementia, and when he died, she was pretty glad. She was like 18. She was happy to see him go. It'd been a long 10 years for her. So it's like, thank you. I think you've opened up a whole nother door to walk through as far as seeing the world in a different and less concrete way.
Well, a lot of cultures do preparation for death. So in the Sufi tradition, for example, they will lay next to a grave site and meditate there. They may sleep there. They may, you know, experience what it'll be like. Some traditions will do the practice of, you know, simulating the death experience and then having people walk around the person. What are people saying about you and how you lived your life? And that can be very therapeutic for people. You know, and I will, you know, we've still got a couple minutes, but I'm going to leave you with an idea, which is to think about what are those things that you're doing today that you want to be remembered for 100 years from now? And what will people be saying? You know, and I think that's what we can begin to manifest is, you know, and the more we practice it, the easier it's going to be.
My husband just passed away on Monday.
I'm sorry.
And he was at home, and it's been about 2 months. But in that time frame, we've had so many miraculous things happen. Family came, they got to talk to each other, share their thoughts and love and what an impact he had on their lives. You know, they said be prepared for some hallucinations and so forth and so on. And he was present the majority of the time, and towards the last week, you could just see him staring off at different places, but he always told you what he was seeing, who he was talking to. Young boys that had been killed in, our sons grew up, and one of their best friends in a boating accident. Well, I was talking to Dale. I haven't seen him in a long time. A fellow that he worked with. He said, oh, Denny was there. And he said, he is still so funny. Gone. And then just so many things. And you could see him shaking his head yes, shaking his head no. He was listening to what they would say. And he would even say after, well, they're trying to tell me to do this. And he said, I'm not quite understanding. So this whole 2 months, not just for me, I mean, we had family in, everybody got to experience this. So I think it was sad, but we were all part of this, and it was just truly, truly amazing. So, and comforting at the same time.
Thank you for sharing that. Again, I'm sorry for your loss, but it continues. Yeah, that's a beautiful story. So Peter Fenwick, he was a neuroscientist. He passed on last year. He's written some things based on experiences in hospice about these transpersonal encounters. So it's, you know, there's just so much of it, and people don't talk about it. And the more we talk about it, the more comfortable we're going to be.
I am Mexican. So we celebrate the Day of the Dead. So I am married to an American man, but today in my home, there is an offering for the dead. and he's going to spend the day cooking for them.
Oh, beautiful.
We have, he's going to make the cake, their favorite food. And that's very, very comforting for us to do. He totally absorbed this tradition of mine, and he works hard at it, and he loves it, and I love it too. And talk about accepting each other's beliefs and accepting other people cultures. The main theme in the wall is an American flag with a Mexican flag. And there's our family, and we're honoring them today. So I'm very happy that I was here and hear all this sharing.
Yeah, I love that tradition because it's so celebratory. In my film, we filmed one of the festivals around Day of the Dead. And, the music, the mariachis playing, and, the food and the drink, and sometimes it's to appease those spirits. There's also that kind of dimension to the worldview. But congratulations, that's a great accomplishment to have that level of synergy in your daily life. Beautiful.
I've been studying death since I was about 27, when I first experienced my father's death. And it sent me on a long roundabout road. I've also had many deaths of both family, friends, and 9 months ago, my husband. I've always been curious about, is there a reason that some people are, I guess what happened to me, I was so affected by death, the first one, and then all others, that I was told that I carry them with me through my life. So I'm curious about, why do some people, and I'm sure there are many of me, that have multiple experiences of loss and death and grief, and now I'm working on grief. But I'm curious about, I know some people where they haven't had any deaths around them. I don't know what you would say to that.
Well, I would say it's a gift, because it has allowed you to consider, to experience, to engage, and grief, just really quickly, there's so many ways to grieve, but there's the inner subjective first person, I'm going to do this. And that can involve something like the psychomantium. It can involve just being present, to be open, in whatever form it takes, and whatever the ontology is about the spirit world, the reality of it, it's what your experience is, and how personal it is. And then there's these collective forms of grief, like the Day of the Dead practices. They are communal. Or, in the film we have, people on Veterans Day and their loss. And coming together in those collective gatherings, expressing the sorrow and the loss, but also feeling the comfort of connection. So I think it's a gift. And I'm with you. I've had lots and lots of experiences, and maybe that has helped me to be more open. But I do believe that it's important. And I think that all of us can, relish the gift that someone gives you when they can help you to make the transition easier. Like their loss. When you lose somebody and they're not there in the physical form, but they've passed easily and given you that opportunity, then it's easier for you to continue that conversation. I think there's something called the continuing bonds theory. And so, sometimes people are told, just get over it. You've had this long enough, get over it. But that isn't really that effective. I don't want to get over it. I want to keep loving this person. I want to feel this person. And there's nothing at all wrong with that. I really believe that that's very healthy. So, all right, well, I just want to thank all of you. Great work out there in the world, just coming here, showing up. Thank you.